to the audience. Good morning, good evening, folks. It's V the Grill Economist coming to you live with my main man, CJ, giving you the news, the views, and all the information important to you. Check us out, roguenews.com. Follow us on Twitter at Real Rogue News and Rogue News on every single podcasting app known to humanity. We are everywhere you want us to be. And also check out our paid sponsors, mycbdedibles.com, mycbdedibles.com, giving you the freshest, highest potency, highest purity CBD products anywhere in the world. The coffee is absolutely delicious. The chocolate almond peanut, white chocolate almond peanut truffles are just delicious. Go there, folks. It's amazing. And also check out the Patreon and a lot of the other exciting projects we're working on. Our exchange is at least a few days away from opening, so you guys will know about it first when we go live. And with that all out of the way, we have the man of the hour. He needs no introduction. He is London Paul from the SiriusReport.com. SiriusReport.com, folks. If you want daily intel briefings, you want to get the inside track, go there. Become a member for less than a price of a Starbucks mocha latte, frappadlapa, whatever drink that they got going on right now. You can get yourself educated on the geopolitical, geostrategic, geoeconomic chessboard that's really happening in the world. Paul gives you the play-by-play and the real 3D chess behind the scenes. And with that being said, London Paul, CJ, what's going on, guys? How are you?
Well, very pleased to be here today and trust you're well.
All I aspire to do is someday is to be able to do intros like you. Okay, that's the goal.
Off the fly, Siege. That is.
I know it's off the cuff.
Do rehearse
just,
off the fly. Everybody says that. He goes, "You have the best intros." I'm like, "Thank you."
I know. I need to practice it in front of a mirror or something.
I missed my chance of being an announcer. I wanted to be the next Billy Mays, the pitch guy selling cleaning products. That was my dream in life. But alas, I'm doing this nonsense.
Only if you get a free additional pillow with purchase. Okay.
Yeah. Call now. Here's how.
Go ahead, V. I'm doing great. Thank you for asking.
Paul, how are you, man? I mean, how's the UK? How's COVID treating you? How's the COVID life? I don't know if you've seen this or not, and I know you've written a letter, which I definitely want to get into. I want to deep dive into what your perspectives on this. But recently, the CDC has come out with their revised COVID numbers, and it is a whopping 9,210 people that have directly died from COVID. 9,210. Absolutely ridiculous, insane, and they are now trying to bury that information and try to make it go away. And anybody who posts that is being banned, shadow banned, you name it. It's the same thing. What is the madness that is gripping the Western world, Paul? And let's segue into that and get into the letter that you wrote Boris Johnson, whom you personally know, by the way. And with that, go ahead, Paul.
Right. Well, start with the UK and a general perspective of things. Yep. To be honest, on a personal level, I can't. I mean, yeah, of course, things are being closed down. Things are opening up now, and of course, you couldn't go to places simply because they weren't open. But I have to say, for us on a personal level, it didn't really interfere too much in our lives. Okay, you can get out now and do things. I mean, yes, there are some ridiculous things that are still in place, and we'll come to that in the context of this letter. With regards to the CDC, I think what's interesting is as much of the fact they actually came out and said this. Now, I mean, that's progress because okay, you can bury it, and I have to say though, as much as the figures, if we say okay, only 6%, the truth of the matter is yes, with all pandemics, whatever people believe it is or it isn't, comorbidities are always the principal reason why people, unfortunately die. Now, it can be that, the argument therefore can be for this 94%. How many of them were going to die anyway? Or how many of them died because of, was COVID-19 the real reason? And okay, all the comorbidities may have contributed to it. So you can't really say definitively where those 94% fit in. However, more importantly, the argument is, well, yes, 6% of people who are of a certain age, under 65 or whatever age they categorize it, and people who are, typically in good health are extremely unlikely to die from this. And that, I think, is more important than trying to dissect the 94%. But I think, to be honest, that's, been understood by a lot of people for a long time. However, CDC coming out with it, I think, is incredibly interesting. And it's kind of one of those things where suddenly they're going, okay, well, we're going to have to admit this. And maybe it's starting to sort of a bit of a lever into the reality of things. Now, people won't be surprised that I don't fall into the government camp of things in terms of, all the government statements. But equally, I don't fall into the extreme other camp regarding a whole bunch of conspiracy stories, which from a personal level, I don't think are extremely helpful. I can understand, and we'll come on to this in terms of the letter I wrote, and why I wrote it the way I did was to pick the points where we can legitimately challenge governments and say, hang on, you're making these decisions. Now, some people will profusely disagree with you, and some people on the other side will completely agree and think everything the government's doing is correct. Well, for me, there is a lot of mistakes they've made. You can give them some leverage and latitude when it started because they didn't have any other idea. But we now reached, for me, this critical juncture where you have to start saying, okay, hang on, maybe we've got to look at this completely differently, because setting aside people's conspiracy theories that it's all been a planned epidemic and there's too many holes in those theories, and there's too many people who've come out and made statements and then contradicted themselves and backtracked away from things. The plain simple fact is there's no planned epidemic from a Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and we've said all this before, so I don't want to get into that because It's fine. People believe what they want to believe. I'm not here. There's no point trying to change people's points of view, because at the end of the day, with something like this, people are going to be quite rigid, whichever side of the fence they want to be, not sat on, but, sort of looking at the people sat on the fence. Now, for me, I always want to take the middle line and says, okay, what is reasonable that the government did perhaps at one point, what is now totally unreasonable, and what are those grey areas in the middle? So the purpose of the open letter was to say, okay, look, we're going to highlight some of the deficiencies of UK government policy now. We can call it UK. It could be, you might as well say the US, you might as well say most nations in Europe and further afield. There's been mistakes made by a whole bunch of nations for different reasons. Now, initially, some of those you can argue might be forgivable. But I think what's worth noting is also, when I made the point, is the one thing that, the virus has worked in lots of mysterious ways, not least in shattering quite a lot of illusions and realities coming to the fore. And one of those I've seen more and more in the UK is that not only is the government and the parliamentary system realizing that people aren't very happy with them, and that they're now seen totally detached from what are the needs of the people, but also it's the fact that this whole pandemic has made people look at party politics or partisan politics and gone, actually, we don't believe in any. I've seen an awful lot of that, which for someone like me who's completely again anti sort of partisan politics as it stands now, for me that's an encouraging development. Now, of course, as I said in the letter, it's not fair to lay all the blame on the current government or the current parliamentary system, because this has been going back a very long time. What certainly contributed to people's anger, fear, and everything in between is a total distrust of government. And that is only growing. And I think in the last, 6 months, it's got worse. I mean, if you've certainly seen it in the US, you see it in the UK and in Europe. And that's completely understandable. But for me, we're now at this point where I said in the letter, it's like this critical juncture, not just with respect to how the government handles this COVID-19 policy, but also because, we know there's a national in the UK financial, economic, societal crisis that's been unfolding. But it didn't just start when we had the pandemic. And there's lots of people trying to go, well, if we didn't have the pandemic, this would never have happened. Well, of course, we know that's nonsense, because you, me, and countless other people have talked for years that, the inevitability of what was going to happen.
Right.
But the point for me is, and I said from when it started, it will be an accelerant of many processes, and it's been an accelerant about the complete negligent monetary and fiscal policies. And we only have to look at the recent Fed statement, where effectively they just held their hand up and went, there's nothing we can do anymore. We're going to create massive inflation. We're going to control the yield curve, which means we're going to have to print dollars like there's no tomorrow. We're just going to blow everything up, and because we can't fix it. And the truth of the matter is, they're not doing this because they've got some magical plan at the end of it to roll something else out, because nothing else can exist after this, because the world rejected the dollar and has been. It's not suddenly going to go to the Fed and other central banks and say, well, okay, you've completely blown everything up, but we'll trust you to run another financial system. It's simply not going to work. So for me, I think what is interesting is the fact that what we're seeing is this sort of idea now of, well, actually, what's more important? Do we stack whatever people's belief is with regards to the risks associated with the pandemic? And there's a lot of those factors I totally disagree with. In fact, now the majority of them. And then there's the flip side that says, well, okay, what's the economic damage? What's the psychological damage, the physiological damage? And, in terms of the UK government's handling, there's countless policy failures. I mean, okay, hindsight with what happened initially is understandable, but once it became obvious that the initial projections for this data were absolute nonsense, there was never going to be 500,000 people or worse dying.
Yep. 2 million dead in the US, 500,000 in the UK.
Yeah, and the question was, okay, whether people agree with this or disagree, the truth of the matter is, if you sat in government and you're the prime minister or the president, and someone gives you statistics that say, millions are going to die or 500,000, you're not going to just ignore it. I know people will say, well, they're all psychopaths and they don't care about anything. Well, that's not strictly true. And they do, because even if they don't on a personal level actually give a damn, if that sort of level of people started dying and worse because they didn't heed the advice, then the one thing they are terrified of is mass revolt, mass protest, and mass insurrection. Yeah, that's because then they have no control. They can't control, 60 million people or 300 million people in the US. So, yeah, and if you look at the UK, they initially said, right, we're going to have herd immunity process. And then suddenly all this data came out, and they abandoned that very quickly and went, no, we're going to have this lockdown. Now, of course, as we know, the data proved to be a gross, overestimation. So fine initially, for argument's sake, that they did what they did. Now, people may disagree, but if you were the president or the prime minister and you risk millions of people dying or 500,000 people dying, would you make the decision to go, well, I'll just ignore this and we'll just do something different? And then it all happens. And then the argument is you've got that on your conscience now, or, there may be serious ramifications for actually failing to heed that warning. So granted, they then went to the policy to lockdown. But they did say, and this was one thing that happened when they first were talking about lockdown, they went, we don't want to do this too early because we'll have lockdown fatigue. And people will get fed up with it, and then they'll just refuse to obey lockdown rules. So they delayed the implementation, which was a stupid mistake. They should have locked down if they were going to immediately. And that was a serious error of judgment, and it caused, yes, this big spike. And I know people will say there was no spike. Well, in the UK, I've tracked all the data for all the deaths in England, because you can't do it for, don't ask me why you can't do it for Scotland. But for England and Wales, you can track all the data. and you saw an enormous spike in deaths on a 5-year average. Fast forward to now, we've had like 9 or 10 weeks now where the 5-year average of deaths is no greater than any other year in the last 5 years. So that then makes you go, hang on, if people aren't dying, then why are we still having this policy? But if you get this enormous spike, which happened in April, then you can go, well, there's some justification for that. But now that justification, I think, is questionable and to a large extent completely inappropriate. And, for me, it's also, there's all this contradictory sort of behavior where they have all these lockdown measures. And then they're set against all these, for me, concerning developments. Now, there's the issues that are directly attributable to COVID-19. And then for me, there's the far more serious consequences, which is indirect consequences. Now they're going to have a short, medium, and long-term effect. So we'll talk about the sort of statistical side of things, because I think that's been a serious bugbear for a lot of people, and with justifiable reasons. So, there's a lot of reports of deaths wrongly attributed to COVID-19, and I think that is absolutely fair. Now, to what extent that is, we don't know. But clearly it was based on this idea that, someone may, as an example, have contracted COVID-19, and then 6 weeks later, they died of something which was probably a comorbidity. And then they went, well, they tested positive for COVID-19 6 weeks ago, so that's a COVID-19 death. Well, that's extremely, unhelpful in assessing the actual statistical output, because the argument then is, did that actually have anything to do with it? And you can't say yes or no, but certainly just not saying every time, well, yes, it is. And then what did they do in the UK? They suddenly reduced the number of deaths by over 10%, the official government data, which then proved, well, is that just the tip of the iceberg? In fact, are they just admitting there's 5,000? Maybe there's 10, maybe there's 7, we don't know. But it certainly bore out the fact that the data they were producing was completely incorrect. And if you're going to admit at least 10%, well, you and I know, does that mean 20% or 30%? We don't know. And then, of course, we then saw this media switch suddenly went from, well, we're not thinking about death so much anymore, because in the UK, there's practically been none for a long time. Very small numbers, well, less than 20, some days 2, some days 3, whatever. And then suddenly it became, oh, actually, we're not going to focus on the number of deaths. We're going to focus on the number of cases. And as I said, when you got this 5 years,
we've seen the same shift here in the US as well, where the cases are spiking with faulty testing equipment. Like, my God, it's. I think the most brilliant politician in the world right now is the Tanzanian president, who sent in samples for goat, papaya, and I think a pigeon or something like that, or some sort of a pheasant. And they all come back tested positive for COVID, and he kicked the World Health Organization right out of his country. It's insanity. This is what kills me is there's no political balls left in the West, Paul. They don't even call it for what it is. Hey guys, you know what? We made a mistake. This whole lockdown was a complete gross overreaction. Here's the deal: we're going to open back up. If you're 65 and older and you got comorbidities, stay home. Wear a mask. The rest of you get back to work. Nope, nothing. The stupidity, Paul. I can go into a restaurant here in upstate New York. I have to wear a mask. I move in 5 feet or 7 feet into the restaurant, then I can sit down and then remove my mask, because somehow the virus is smart. The virus has figured out, and it's very polite, and it knows that when I'm eating, not to infect me, Paul. It knows this. And it also knows that when I protest,
enjoy your meal. That's what it is.
Yes, it wants me to enjoy my meal. It wants me to also express my freedom of protest. And if I want to riot and loot the Omega boutique in Manhattan or Louis Vuitton, it understands that. It understands that, and it recedes in its capacity to attack and infect me, Paul. This is stupidity. It's like this whole thing is made up by idiots, and it's being controlled by morons.
Well, this is what I know. There's people who disagree with me, and I've said this on Twitter for a long time. Never underestimate the absolute incompetence and stupidity of people in government. I know everyone or not everyone, but people like to think there's some big nefarious plan and there's all these, Western equivalents of Putin moving chess pieces around and fomenting these nefarious plans, etc. It's just simply not true. And
it's gross stupidity.
I put an article on my own website, well, a couple of months or more ago, saying 100 reasons why this so deep state power has failed, and that was in a short period of time. I could have put 1,000 points, but anyway, we digress. Going back to the thing, the other issue is it's fine giving case numbers, but if you're suddenly increasing the amount of testing, and we'll come to the test in a minute, tenfold, then you're always going to have more cases. So
right.
That's an irrelevance. What you have to do is there has to be this balance between the number of cases and the number of fatalities. And when, I mean, you may have these spikes in the number of cases, for argument's sake, which we have, not spikes, but increases. But if your 5-day moving average or your 7-day moving average for fatalities is tailing off, there comes a point surely when you go, well, we need to start shifting the focus from these cases and actually look at the number of fatalities. And this then feeds into these indirect consequences. But one last point with regards to the test. Yeah, there are absolutely legitimate concerns as to their reliability, and I think that is a huge question and a huge problem. And one can argue, of course, that therefore case numbers published, and I'm being pretty generous when I say a question. Well, I think it's far more significant than the word question. I think you can probably drive, you have a saying in the UK, you can drive a double-decker bus through that theory. And therefore the question therefore even becomes more, is the number of actual cases less? What is the demographic of cases? Because it seems to be in Europe now, more younger people are getting them, in which case they're not regarded as a risk category. And maybe, sadly, the people who are most at risk have already, passed on. And maybe that's why the number of, fatalities is sort of dropped right off. But also, you're right, with government policy, there's all these ridiculous contradictions. But in this country, they kind of went, okay, well, we're going to have all this furlough and we're going to pay all these people money and they can all sit around. And by the way, we're going to close businesses, but the rest of you can all work from home. And everybody started working at home and going, do you know what? This is great. I actually prefer this. I'm more productive at home, and big businesses are going, do you know what? We don't need these, these skyscrapers. We don't need to have big HQs in London, Paris, New York, or wherever else. So we're going to cut back on our expenditure, and we're going to have people working at home. And the government went, oh, hang on a minute. You can't do that because, if you go to London, for example, there's a whole sort of community that exists around, the city of London or Canary Wharf or wherever, with shops and everything, and no one's going in them, so they're all going bust. And they suddenly went, well, actually, you all need to return to work, when they spent months and months creating a climate of unnecessary fear. So people are now going, do you know what? I don't want to work. I don't want to go to London. I don't want to get on a train. I don't want to get on a tube train that's full of people. And I've had pictures sent to me of trains and tube trains where during sort of, between the hours of 7 and 9, where normally you're like a sardine in a can. And there's quite literally nobody on these trains. So they created this problem. And it's also very clear that they're now starting to go, well, we've got this economic imperative because everything's blowing up and we can't allow this to happen. And in the UK, they are terrified now of the entire economy collapsing, which of course is ultimately going to anyway. But this is driving their lockdown policies, but they're utterly contradictory. And you make this point, and I'll come to this shortly with a couple of points. And that adds to this climate of distrust, climate of fear. People are going, I'm sorry, what are you telling me? Because it's like here, we now, what was it, April, May, June, and part of July, they went, just go in the supermarket, just kind of socially distance, but don't worry too much. And then suddenly in July, they went, no, you need to wear face masks in supermarket. And there's all these additional screening, because we have, when you get to the supermarket, you can have self-checkout, you just check. And so they put screens between each one of those and hand sanitizers everywhere and trying to be sort of directing people to go with the flow of the supermarket and not against the flow. And this wasn't present for months. And people are going, hang on, you're telling us it's not as bad. You're opening things up, but in the process, you're making more restrictions in supermarkets. And then they started going, oh, hang on, people aren't going into supermarkets as much as they were. Yeah, because they don't want to go through all this inconvenience and they don't want to wear face masks. And of course, what makes the entire policy redundant in a supermarket is you go in there and the staff not wearing masks. Now, bearing in mind the staff have the most contact with all the people coming in and out of supermarkets on 8-hour shift or whatever they do. Therefore, they're in contact with far more people on a daily basis than the likes of you and I going into a supermarket, but we have to wear a mask and they don't, which is utterly contradictory. And therefore, you have to raise the question, why are we even doing this? And of course, this fuels people's conspiracy of they're up to something. No, they're just absolutely clueless. And
idiots.
We have this issue here with pubs, restaurants, cafes. Since they've opened, they actually had this scheme where there were, huge discounts if you went net out, because they're trying to encourage people to go back into pubs. Because the first time we went in the day after they opened them, and there was just no one there. It was us and some staff. So they did this and to encourage people. And we've been in places quite a few times. Now, here's the difference rather than the US. You walk into these places, you never need to wear a mask. Okay? Which, okay, granted, you eat there. So the argument is, well, yeah, you can't eat with a mask on. However, if you base the government's criteria in supermarkets why you have to wear masks and all this social distancing the same way, then those places shouldn't even be open based on the same criteria. But they're open, and you don't ever have to wear a mask. And this apparently poses, some serious challenges on what's government's policy and advice. And what compounds all these contradictions is, prior to anyone wearing a mask, there was all these comments, well, they're ineffective anyway, so there's no point in bothering to wear them. And then suddenly it was. So there's all these contradictory policies, and we could go on forever. I mean, I could give you all sorts of examples, but there's no point in boring everyone to death with the problems that you have in terms of or the potential problems you have in everyday life. I mean, on a personal level, where we are is very quiet. We've never seen a single police officer and any enforcement of anything. And I know there's stories of things happening. I don't doubt things have happened, but I don't think they're as bad in the context of everything that's going on. I mean, we know enough people around the country who've told us of their experiences, and by and large, it's not been that bad. But of course, they do have stupid regulations that go, well, if you do this, then you can get fined. And then anyway, that's the kind of direct consequences. So there's all this contradiction, and therefore, what it proves is where there's an economic imperative to try and get the economy going. Bearing in mind the UK's predominantly service-based economy, they go, well, let's just turn a blind eye to these rules a bit, because we can't continue having these rules, because otherwise no restaurants will open, no pubs, no one will go shopping in the high street, and therefore we have to sort of work on the basis that we'll just kind of bend the rules a bit. So yeah, it's draconian in a supermarket, and then when you're eating in pubs, then we just forget all those rules, and you don't need to worry about them. But then we come to this. For me, this is the really critical thing that's always been the case, and it's that balance between what's the direct impact of the virus, and to a large extent in the UK, as an example, you can argue with a high degree of confidence that the regulations and rules that are in place are really no longer applicable. But there's the flip side to this, and that's the damage that's being done indirectly. Because why? Well, we have obviously GP, general practitioner surgery, that's your local doctor. Well, they've been shut for months, so people couldn't have consultations. They therefore didn't have subsequent hospital treatment, which is probably going to result in people dying now unnecessarily. and there's other people going to have diseases and complications. I mean, stating the obvious, imagine if someone suddenly thinks, oh, hang on, I've discovered a lump, maybe it's cancerous or isn't, they don't get subsequent treatment. Yeah, they're more at risk of dying. I mean, that's just a very simplistic example, but you can extrapolate that where someone might go, oh, I've got a bit of a pain in my chest, or maybe it's indigestion, and then it turns out it's not. So, you know, we can go on forever about the risk, but there is an indirect consequence of maintaining this lockdown. Now, of course, the longer they keep these policies in place, this is going to become a bigger problem. And why is it going to become a bigger problem? Because we're now entering autumn and we start to have the flu season, which you have in the US as well, of course. So you're going to have more people ill. But of course, there's people who may get the flu, don't go and see a doctor for whatever reason, and they may end up, you know, seriously ill or worse. And so therefore, when taking risks that result in the deaths, I think, of more people than the number of deaths from the virus itself, you then have to start saying your policy decisions have failed. And then, of course, there's as well as all the physiological issues. What about the long-term psychological damage? I mean, we've actually seen this personally where there's people really fearful. And this is going to have a lasting effect on people. Even if the virus disappeared tomorrow, you're going to have people for years who won't want to go out. They're going to be fearful. They're constantly going to wear a mask, and they're going to be
they're going to
extremely
hear a sneeze, and they're going to run away. They're going to run across the street, possibly get hit by a car because somebody sneezed, Paul.
Well, you know, and I have seen, you know, people where people are really nervous, and ironically, it's not generally people. Because where we live, there's a high demographic of older people. They're all pretty chilled and just going about their lives and going, well, it is what it is. But it's actually younger people, I would say sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, who seem far more anxious. But of course, the ongoing economic damage is going to place enormous burdens on people in society, not just the fact they lost their job, but you're going to see, you know, people getting very depressed. You're going to see risks of addiction. You're going to domestic violence, health issues, and a lot of psychological trauma. And then, of course, you know, how do you quantify that? I mean, how bad has it been, and how bad is it going to get much worse? And I made the point of telegraphing a problem which we know is coming. We're going to have the flu season. So what's the odds that they're going to start misdiagnosing people who have flu and 100%. Saying, oh, they've got COVID-19?
And then, Paul, what about the fear that people who get the flu and they're going to be, oh my God, I have COVID, because they're already terrified of the nonsense, and the confusion has really scared them, Paul. And now they have a high fever, and they're coughing, and they have a stuffy nose, and they have a headache, and now they're thinking that they have COVID.
Well, yes, and you and I know as well as anyone that fear, what it can do to a person. I mean, people live in fear. It compromises their immune system, makes them more susceptible to all manner of things. So here's the problem. Suddenly, they're going to misinterpret the number of flu cases, and we're going to have apparently the least flu cases on record over a winter, and suddenly a spike in COVID cases, and maybe subsequent deaths because people die of the flu. And then they're going to go, oh, there's a massive spike in cases and deaths. Oh, we're going to have to lock everything down again. And therefore that will cause enormous further economic damage and further physiological, psychological impact. Now we start to get into millions of people. I mean, is it 5 million in the UK, 10, 20 million? We don't know. So really, for me, there comes a point when the tens of millions of people who are impacted as an indirect consequence suddenly has to be a far more important precedent over the very small percentage of people who actually get the virus, and then, of course, a significantly lesser proportion of those resulting in deaths. Now, the thing is, when people, and I've said this to people, and people go, no, I don't buy this, but governments are terrified of a second lockdown. That is why they're doing a lot of these harebrained policies, because they think if we have a second, you know, if we're, a second wave, and then we have a total lockdown, they know what the consequence is going to be. Bear in mind, there's this economic imperative. Please, everyone, go back to work. Just go back to work. we've even got schemes in the UK where they're telling companies, look, if you take people on from the age of 16 to 25, we'll pay their salary for 6 months. They're just desperate to kind of short-sighted, myopic policy. But you can see their attitude is one of desperation. So they're going to absolutely panicking that if we have a second complete lockdown, then whatever's left of the economy is gone. And therefore, what are we going to have? Unemployment 30%. We're going to have practically every business out, going bust. And what is the damage going to be? And more importantly, they're fearful that people will then rise up and say, I had everything and now I've got nothing. Now, okay, we know what's going on with the real economy, but they're going to focus on that being the reason. And of course, ironically, the government's given them the mandate to do that because they keep telling us, oh, if we hadn't had the coronavirus, none of this would have happened. Now, yes, I can understand why governments don't want people to be complacent. And that's a reasonable standpoint. But the media response is ridiculously disproportionate. And of course, this contrary sort of government policy, I think, has been very, very self-evident. And then, of course, there's, from time to time, people are coming out going, well, this lockdown essentially, until we have a vaccine, is going to have to continue. Well, that's just ridiculously myopic because there's already, whatever people's views on vaccines are, and we're not here to deliberate that. The virus keeps mutating, so the benefits of a vaccine may be limited. And here's the point. Imagine if they persuade, 70% of the population to be vaccinated. They vaccinate them, everyone thinks it's all right. The government thinks everything's okay. Everyone goes back to normal, and then the vaccine doesn't work after 3 months. And then suddenly they're back into panic stations again because suddenly they're going to see this spike in cases, and then they'll just lose their heads and go back into total lockdown. And then, for me, one of the biggest concerns is where's the publication of data? The government tends to hide a lot of it. And then there was, in the UK, there's a company called Sage, and someone leaked data, which I think was going on about, 80,000 cases over the winter. And I think it was just ridiculously alarming and indicative of a pattern where you get advice given to governments and no one seems to scrutinize it. No one's going, well, actually, we've been given this data of 500,000 deaths. Hang on. What statistics do we have for previous, pandemics or the risk of them? Were those ever accurate? And the question is, well, the answer is absolutely not. So, yes, it's worth considering things, but you have to have a balance of probability. Now, here's the big problem. Well, presuming Trump wins, which, in November, which is increasingly more and more likely, the economic impact, I think, has been mitigated because the Fed have basically said, well, we'll just do whatever it takes to keep everything going. So Trump, let's work on the assumption he gets re-elected. Now, in the case of Johnson, he's not even 1 year into a 5-year fixed term office. So governments often can make the most horrendous mistakes and they're out of office and no one remembers that it was that government policy that may, screwed everything up. Well, Trump, if he gets re-elected, and of course Johnson in this case, are not going to have this luxury. If we'd had a stable economy, which neither the UK or the US has had, then the impact would have been a lot less pronounced than whether people like it or not. That's why China is not impacted anywhere near as much as Western nations. Okay, forget the virus policy and why. Go to Wuhan. Wuhan's completely back to normal. Everybody has a totally normal life.
They had a pool party like 2 weeks ago. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, but
DJs
I think
and everything.
They were trolling the West by doing that.
I believe that.
Let's not work.
Well, I believe that wholeheartedly.
But coming back to the whole economic thing, yes, and I made the point in the letter. Look, its central bank policy is masking the reality of all the problems, the economic, financial, and societal carnage, I think was the word I used, that's going to unfold because of all this crass policy. Now, the problem that the current government has and Trump's going to have is they're going to experience the full effects of what's unfolding, within, whether it's Trump's second term or Johnson's first term. And therefore, it's critical they make the right decisions with regards to the economy. Okay, the economy's blown up, but there's ways to mitigate some of the problems. And therefore, what's your virus policy? And it's obvious they're not doing that. And if they continue the way it is, then whatever that fears they had, they're going to be infinitely greater of what's unfolding, because the thing that makes them able to keep people passive is when people don't actually think that it's a problem. And for the last 10, 12 years, people go, well, it's not really a problem. They must have fixed everything. By and large, I'm okay. But the last 6 months, millions of people losing jobs, millions of people now facing the threat of foreclosure or not being able to pay their rent. And okay, then the government is stepping in and going, well, we'll bail you out. We'll give you, rental holidays or mortgage holidays. And they're going to have to keep pumping money because they realize if they don't, what's the risk? You're going to have tens of millions, or in the US, I don't know, 50 million, who knows, of people who are going to effectively suddenly become homeless. They don't have jobs, and then they're going to turn around, and then it's suddenly become a major problem for the entire population. And it's just something they genuinely are terrified of, because they could go stomping around the world and implement some policy in Iran or Iraq or Syria or Ukraine, or they can screw some nation over, and people at home go, oh well, I'll just believe what the government tells me. And yeah, I am distrustful of the government, but I've still got a job. I can go to work. I've got a nice house, or I'm not doing too bad. But as soon as that entire situation changes, and I always use the analogy, you put a ton of manure on the doorstep of every single home in the UK and the US, the entire dynamic changes. And then suddenly, this is why the idea they planned all this. No, I'm sorry. Well, there's a lot of reasons it doesn't stack up. But the principal one is they do not want to see 300 million really angry Americans. They don't want to see 50 million or whatever angry British people going, I had everything and now I have lost it all. You have caused this. And what are you going to do to fix it? Well, you can't fix it. And we know they can't fix anything. So that, and therefore, we slip into this hyperinflationary world, and eventually they're probably just going to have to pay everyone universal basic income until everything just blows up in totality, and we have Venezuelan inflation.
That's funny that you say that, Paul, because that seems to be the track that we're on. I remember a few years ago, even recently as of date, I said the especially this coronavirus. I never saw this coronavirus being the igniter of this global reset that's occurring. But the only way they're going to sustain, the only way the Western world is going to sustain the coming stagflation, the coming hyperinflation, is they're going to have to take the Dow to 35,000 points. They're going
to have higher.
Or higher. They're going to have to institute negative interest rates. At the same time, universal basic income will begin. It's the only way. It's the only way.
But the thing is,
and this will pop up and fall apart. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, yeah, and this is the important part, because look, there's a lot of theories out there in the alt media world that goes and what they do is they take a basic point at the end, and it all gets twisted, and then it gets twisted into this theory. So the big theory is, well, their intention is to put everyone on universal basic income to control everybody. Well, okay, let's assume they do this. And how long is it going to be before the dollar, the pound, well, they're all blowing up anyway, but when they're destroyed in totality and currency becomes worthless? Because what are they going to print? Give everyone, I don't know, $1,500 a month, or 300 million Americans, or 250 million? And how long is that going to be before, Main Street inflation becomes intolerable? It already starting to. And therefore you descend into Venezuela. And that's their solution to control people. When you destroy them and you're saying to someone, oh, you paid what, $2 for a loaf of bread? Oh, it's going to be $4 in a week's time, or in a month's time. And they really think that's a controlling mechanism? No, it absolutely isn't. And that's where, there's this idea, and things get twisted, and And then it's turned into this nefarious plot that they're intentionally doing this. Well, if they were, why have they done everything since 2008 to prevent this happening? Because in 2008, they could have caused exactly the effect they wanted to. But here's the big advantage. They wouldn't have had all this enormous debt, all this ridiculous QE zero interest rate policy. They could have leveled everything to the ground, blown everything up, legitimately got away with it, and said, well, we're going to have to rebuild from scratch. Oh, by the way, we're going to have to introduce all these measures in the process, and done it in a way that you wouldn't have destroyed everyone in the process. But no, they kept following this process through. Now they've destroyed absolutely everything. Yep. And people think, oh, that's intentional. Well, if for the whole process to work, they have to make sure things don't blow up. But they just do enough to control, people in the sense, not overtly, but in a way that they can just keep things ticking along and the system benefits them. And one other thing, I want to mention the cashless society thing, because it keeps rearing its head. We get countless people going, well, the moves to a cashless society. And look, we've explained before why that's not reality, because a trillion plus dollars a year of money slushes through the system with all in cash, and that's the narco trade, the trafficking, and all the other really worse than despicable things I'd rather not mention. But here's the other thing. They don't need to roll, and everyone goes, they're rolling out a digital currency to control us all. Well, here's the point. You have a digital bank account. Why do they need to roll another digital anything out? They can control you.
Exactly my point. They people are like, we're going to roll the digital dollar. You moron. You have a debit card.
Yes. But the other problem is they say, well, what they can do is with this new digital dollar, they can just shut you down. Well, do you know what they can do? They can freeze your assets tomorrow and shut all your access off to your bank account on any spurious whim they want to, if they really want to do that. So here's the question. They could have done that for years. Why have they never done it? So again, it's spinning a story that they'll roll out digital currencies because it's a controlling mechanism. Well, they already can control you, and people say, well, we have cash, and they're going to prevent cash. Well, the usage. Well, we've already said why that won't happen. And here's the other point. How many people seriously now have all their money stashed under a mattress in their house and don't utilize a bank account and use a digital bank account that already exists? Few and far between. So they don't have to do anything draconian. They can control people, and if they want to in the future, they can just switch people's bank accounts off. If they want to fine people, they'll just directly go to your bank account and take the money at source, which they can do already anyway. So again, it's another idea that's, all these ideas, what's the common theme? It's all disempowering people. It's all driving fear into people to make them go, they're going to do this in the future. They're going to do that in the future. And the truth of the matter is, they don't need to. It's like, oh, there's going to be mass surveillance. They've surveilled people for decades. Yeah, okay, and it's like, well, they'll microchip us. They don't need to. You've got a microchip. It's called a mobile phone.
And they can track iPhone. It's called your Android device.
Yeah, they can track your every movement if they want to. Well,
to within 3 feet, Paul. To within 3 feet or less. And
the question is, how? All right, they've been able to do this. Tell me all the people who've disappeared in America because of this. It doesn't happen, or the UK. The truth is, they have all these mechanisms. It's like we're going through a new technological revolution. That is coming, absolutely. And what does that gets twisted into? It's all a technocracy. It's all to control you and subvert you. Well, here's an interesting fact whether people believe in the virus or don't believe in the virus. The reason why China cleared up the virus so much quicker was through 5G technology. They have advanced technology, and they were able to identify any little pockets anywhere in China and nip it in the bud and stop it. That's why China's recovered.
5G causes coronavirus to spread.
Yeah, but there's the incredible story. First of all,
it's weaponized, Paul. It'll melt your eyeballs and your skull.
Yeah, it was a bioweapon. Then it became well, actually, no, it's caused by 5G. And then it became, well, actually, the virus doesn't exist. And then it became, well, in fact, no viruses exist. It's all nonsense. And I'm sorry, but
round and round we go. Where it stops, nobody knows.
yeah, and it's constantly backtracking on things. I mean, and the proof is, look at China. China is rolling out 5G like there's no tomorrow everywhere. There is hundreds of thousands of base stations rolled out, even when the virus, we had a lockdown. Well, why are we seeing massive spike in cases of viruses in China?
Exactly.
Why do we have high cases in Iran? Where there is no 5G.
Where there is no 5G, exactly correct. And Paul, I just want to break this down real quick. I'm like a technology enthusiast, right? And when I started hearing, look at this, these are idiotic rumors on the web. Look at this. 5G technology. Wuhan was the rollout city for 5G technology. It wasn't. And
No.
Wuhan was targeted because it has the highest concentration of Christians in China. It doesn't. Wuhan was targeted because there were about to be anti-government protests in China. No, it wasn't. They were actually protesting a trash compactor.
Yeah.
God honest truth. They were angry about a trash compactor. Oh, there were high levels of sulfur. Yes, there was a compactor that was running, that was burning. It wasn't they were burning the bodies. Oh.
Well, also, if you burn bodies, you don't get sulfur production anyway like that.
You don't.
No,
you don't.
so
but
this is unfortunately this is a big fundamental problem. So my reasoning for writing this letter, apart from the fact someone said to me, "Can you write this and stick it out there?" is if people want to challenge governments, you have to stick to these kind of facts. Because do you know the biggest damage from conversations I've had with people? They've said to me, believe it or not, if you want to challenge governments, the worst thing that's happening in people challenging governments is all these claims that have no basis in fact, and that is damaging the ability of the likes of you and I to go and have proper discussions with people and say, look, there's legitimate concerns here and there's a legitimate concern. And for me, I have to ask the question, who actually benefits from all this, exaggerated claims? Not the likes of you and I, actually the very people who, in fact, may have nefarious intent to do X, Y, Z, not associated with the virus, but in a general sense. If a truth movement, for want of a better word, wants to be taken seriously, then deal with facts. And then you can affect some change. You can build relationships up. And if you build a consensus, then they buckle and they have to give in. Now, just as a sort of very trivial example, but to highlight the point, there's a thing in the UK where they have this Last Night at the Proms, and they sing these certain songs, and the BBC said they were outlawing it, and there was an enormous uproar. And the long and short of it is, they backed off and went, "No, we're not. We'll just continue." Now, that's a trivial example, but the point is that's how you affect change when there's a positive number of people who challenge governments or challenge some decision. And we're seeing that in the UK now. When you get groups of people and they challenge something in a significant way, things are changing. That's how you make it change. But if you start making statements about viruses, you start making statements regarding, virus policy and how, you go to start talking to people in government places and say, this is a plot to kill us all with a vaccine, or you're trying to deliberately wreck our economies because you want to roll out some dystopian state, they're going to look at you and go away. I don't want to engage with you. If you go to them and say, look, these are the economic problems. By you doing this, you're going to create this, and this. Then they sit down and go, okay, that's a reasonable point of view. And that's where, for me, the alt media fails miserably, because people don't deal with the facts. They use embellished stories to highlight a problem that may have legitimacy, but it loses your ability to discuss things. Have a problem with 5G? Great. But couch it in terms of a virus. No one wants to talk to you. No one's interested. But if you go to people and say, look, maybe there's some legitimate concerns about this, but I'm not associating it with anything else, then people will sit down and go, okay, what's the reason? Okay, maybe this needs to be looked into. That's the big difference, and that's the point everyone's missing. If you want to affect change in the future in any nation, you have to have a concerted thing. And that's why it works, because if you do it politically, you've always got two people, or they're so far apart, they all disagree with each other. But if you get something that's non-political or transcends this faux political divide and you bring people together, you can affect change. If you had 20, 50 million Americans complaining about X, Y, and Z from all sides of America, all political divides, and said, we've had enough of this, it would end. You would see change, because it's the one thing that will change things, is massive amounts of people all agreeing with something. But it has to be legitimate. If it isn't, no one's going to take any notice, and you're utterly wasting your time doing it. And I'm speaking from experience, like on a separate matter, which I said to both you and CJ before we came on, which is nothing to do with this. There's a matter I'm trying to engage with at government level across several governments and trying to highlight something. And when you have a constructive dialogue with people, they'll listen to you. It doesn't mean they're going to change everything because you've said it. But if we get millions of people in constructive dialogue, then we have a chance of changing things. Until we do that, it won't happen. And I'm sorry that may upset people, but it's a stark reality. So don't go to the fringes and the extremes of what the alt media say. Pick the important points, focus on those. And the alt media could have been a very powerful force for change.
It's been ruined.
But it has been ruined. Yes, exactly.
It has been ruined. Paul, we're coming up to a hard stop. I know CJ has an appointment to run to. I would love for you to do your your closing comments, and I got to get you back on again, man. If we can do this again next week, that'll be awesome, because there's a lot to unpack here.
No, I'm happy. I'm happy to do things. I mean, obviously, this kind of we're kind of juggling a few. Well, obviously, we do the Gadfly. I do my own podcast. We're also just very briefly writing this ebook, which started off that it was be a reset ebook, and then we started going, no, we need to include this, and then we started going, no, we need to include this, and no, we need to, and now it's morphed into something that was supposed to be what's happened in the last 5 years, and we've had to go back 100 years.
Absolutely, exactly,
and tie all these things together. So, but no, I'm sure we can find time to chat about things. I'm more than happy to do it. But look, at the end of the day, I know there's people out there who don't agree with me. That's fine. But I'll say this to you. I do things for constructive reasons. I don't want the madness in this world to thrive, and it's dying anyway. Right. But just because I don't agree with what people, I say things and I don't go to the extremes of people's perception on viruses, I don't agree with a lot of it. And I've tried to make representation very quietly for months with the UK government on things to try and say, look, can you look at this and consider it? And I think that's a more constructive way of doing things, because that's the other thing. A lot of people get very frustrated and angry, but what do? They just go and complain on social media to a bunch of other people who are all complaining. Now, that's fine, but at the end of the day, what do you want to do to make things change? You have to do something constructive and choose constructive ways of engaging with people. And if enough of you do it, it will affect change. I don't doubt that. And I know people say that won't affect change. Well, try it, because so far all the other ideas are not working. So maybe try things a bit differently, and you might be pleasantly surprised that it can work.
Very well said. London Paul, folks. London Paul, again, go there, SiriusReport.com. He is one of the most level-headed players in the game. And with that being said, CJ, take it away.